Welcome back to Keeping the Faith with Father Joseph. I am your host, Father Joseph, and today we are joined by our special guest, Carl R. Trueman. Carl Trueman is a theologian, historian, and cultural commentator known for his insightful analysis of modern identity and Western thought. He taught at several institutions, including the University of Nottingham and Westminster Theological Seminary, where he held the Paul Woolley Chair of Church History. He currently serves as a professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College in Pennsylvania and is an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Among his many writings, Trueman is best known for The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and The Road to Sexual Revolution, which came out in 2020. In this work, he explores how Western culture's understanding of the self shifted from being rooted in objective moral and divine order to being defined by personal emotion and self-expression. Trueman's scholarship combines historical precision and cultural insight, helping readers to understand the philosophical forces shaping modern life. He also wrote a book called Strange New World, which is a condensed version of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and it's a very good read. Highly, highly recommended. So today, our topic is artificial intelligence and human identity. So today we're going to be continuing the conversation that I had begun last time when I discussed what the church had to say about artificial intelligence in general. Today we're going to talk about what does it mean to be a self, especially as pertains to artificial intelligence, and how has artificial intelligence impacted our sense of who we are. So I hope you enjoy, and may God bless you. So, Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast, Keeping the Faith with Father Joseph. Today, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and human identity. And so, first of all, thank you so much for being here today.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Father Joe.
Of course. So, last time I talked about how the church has begun to grapple with this new form of technology in the realm of computer science. I covered a document called Antiqua et Nova and other various church documents, kind of beginning to just wade through these new waters. And I'm sure that's, for you, that's also been, I think that's been the experience for all of us, is we're just trying to get a grapple on this new form of technology. First and foremost, what are your first thoughts on, especially as a teacher? You're currently teaching at Collegeville in Pennsylvania, correct?
Grove City College, yes. Although I'm at Notre Dame for this year as a research fellow.
Okay, great. Well, first and foremost, are you seeing a lot of students, using AI like ChatGPT, stuff like that? Has it had any kind of negative or positive impact on your students' education? Have you had any problems with students submitting a paper that's not written by them?
Yeah, I personally have not yet detected a paper that's has popped up as being probably composed by AI. But I would say that uh, artificial intelligence is the biggest challenge to higher education at the moment. Uh, my full-time job is at Grove City College, and the administration are wrestling with this continually. I've come to Notre Dame, and I'm very interested to see on the faculty mailing list how often artificial intelligence pops up. I think it's presenting a challenge to higher education that we're not capable of answering at the moment, and things are changing so fast. That I do think in the next 5 to 10 years there will have to be a fundamental rethinking, for example, about how we assess students. I've got a friend who's the president of a small Presbyterian seminary, and I know that I was asking him, how are you handling this? And his answer was, well, we've returned to oral examinations, that they've shifted to an old-fashioned, as we might say, form of assessment. And I can see a day where handwritten papers and oral examinations become much more common than they are today. Having said that, I'm fortunate. I teach in the humanities. Biggest classes I teach are 25 to 30 students. I have colleagues in the sciences who will teach classes of 200, 300, 400 kids. I don't know how you examine orally 300 engineers, for example. So I think we know it's a huge challenge on the assessment front, but we are as yet not clear on how to address it.
Yeah, well, I actually, in talking about this with some people about how to address that exact problem, and it seems like, obviously you presented the problem of like, what do you do if you have 30, 400 students, stuff like that. But it seems to me that one solution is, yeah, oral exams and handwritten tests and no computers. I mean,
And
because
no
that way,
smart watches either. You've got to strip them of their watches as well these days.
Well, and it brings up an interesting point, because it says something about the purpose of education. Like, why do we go to school in general? And it also says something about what it means to be human as beings who can know the truth. I actually was listening to one of your talks at the Napa Institute, and you were talking about how we have a hunger for truth. And I think in general, whatever point in history you want to go to, just like any virtue, like a muscle, it requires a lot of work to build up that muscle. And so naturally, intellectual virtue takes time to build up. At first, it's like going to the gym, you don't want to, but then eventually you realize, oh, this is actually good. And I think that students using, whether it be ChatGPT or other forms of artificial intelligence, to replace that genuine work that has to go in, it's leading to a blunting of their learning ability and their learning process, but also it's defeating the purpose of why they went. It's like school is becoming something also that I just need to get done,
Yeah.
versus like I'm trying to better myself. I'm trying to learn truth so that not only I could just use it, but also so that because I'm a truth knower, and that's part of my real human flourishing and fulfillment is I can know the truth, and that in itself is a good thing.
Yeah, I think absolutely that's the case. We've been shifting our understanding of education, of course, for quite a while now. That it's become more and more about credentialing for a professional career, and less about learning what it means to be a human being. And that will tilt education towards a focus upon information and technique, if I can put it that way, rather than virtue and wisdom. And if you have a view of education that it's all about information, for example, then why not substitute it with artificial intelligence? Why not substitute it with good web searches? Why do you need to know this stuff if it's simply a question of you need to jump through a hoop or you need to get this stamp on your passport in order to get into the workplace? So there are bigger, artificial intelligence is being received into a culture that's been undergoing what I would say are unfortunate transformations for quite some time now. That's why the world is so receptive to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it actually, helps us to turn to the point of, we're talking about the value of education for the human person, but it begs the question, what is the human person? Like, what does it mean to be a knower, a being that can know? Because if you understand that, then you'll understand the value of education. If you don't understand man, then you're not going to understand the value of what man can actually do, the powers of our soul to know and to will. Versus if you don't know who man is, you can come up with a wrong concept of the human person, which leads to kind of a degradation of human identity where life is about utility or about transaction where
Yeah.
or about getting things done. Education is seen as a task or a utility something like that, versus like, oh, wait a minute, I know who I am as a human person, that I am a knower, and that's why I go after knowledge, because it's actually a gift to be able to do that. Hence, we would say that there's different kinds of degrees of knowing, and we're called to not just gather data, but savor the truth and gather and gain wisdom.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, from a Christian perspective, what does it mean to be a human person? Well, it's to be a creature made in the image of God. We share certain things in common with other creatures. For example, we need to replace lost calories. We need to reproduce. But being made in the image of God also implies a whole range of other things. It implies that we have a nature that has limits and ends, for example. And I would say, there's a threefold aspect, at least, to the image of God. One, being made in the image of God gives us certain intrinsic qualities that are not possessed by other creatures. And I would say one of those is we are free, rational beings. I decide to paint a picture in a way that a beaver never really decides to build a dam. It's purely instinctive. I have a freedom relative to my actions. Secondly, there is a definite moral structure to human nature, that freely behaving in certain ways enhances the God-designed nature of my person in a way that behaving in other ways does not, or militates against them. And thirdly, there's, to use the sort of theological terminology, there's an eschatological dimension to this, that life is meant to be a pilgrimage towards, I love I'm not a Catholic, but I love that Catholic term, the beatific vision. We are, to use language of my own Presbyterian tradition, what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And that points to the teleology that good Protestants and good Catholics hold in common, that the moral nature of our life here and now is actually preparing us and carrying us forward on that journey towards the consummation of all things in the beatific vision. So we're creatures who have a given moral structure, and we realize ourselves most fully when we understand that structure and we live in accordance with it. And that, I think, means that for us, knowledge can never be purely information. There's a great confusion today in our information technology age that we tend to think information is knowledge. The Christian understanding of knowledge is much richer than that. Knowledge is about understanding who we are, that has immediate existential and practical consequences for how we live, how we relate to other people, how we understand our obligations towards others and towards God. So, a rich understanding of what it means to be human is absolutely central, particularly, I think, in a technological age now when, the challenges of technology often offer fundamental challenges to what it means to be human. And that's where I think the pinch for us really is.
No, absolutely. I was recently at a priestly convocation. It's basically a time where the priests of the diocese get together to pray together with the bishop and have fellowship, fraternity, stuff like that. And I was having a conversation with another priest, just something recently that I was thinking about as I get older is, this sense of, as I get older and as I, relate to the Lord and relate to other people, I'm amazed. I'm constantly amazed by these little moments where I realize that there's so much more to know. And there's so much that I previously didn't see, but now I see about
Right.
myself, about others, and about God. And that experience leads to contemplation and to savoring those moments, which cannot be reduced to just data gathering. When that moment happened, those moments happen. I don't just be like, okay, I gathered some facts now. That's very interesting, but rather it leads to a moment of sitting in the truth or dwelling in the truth, or as we talk about our final end, that teleology, like that moving towards God, we're ultimately called to know God, who said, I am the truth. And also, we're called to rest in Him, to rest in that truth for all eternity, and to contemplate that truth for all eternity, and to enjoy that truth. Truth is meant to be enjoyed, savored, contemplated. It doesn't mean that we don't have moments where we're just gathering facts and stuff like that. But that, like you were saying, we can't reduce truth to just facts and data to be used or to be acquired, because then it always leaves us high and dry with a sense of, well, now what?
Yeah, and I think the most beautiful example in outside of the Bible of that is Augustine's Confessions. That is a wonderful text where, and Augustine, you were drawing, I think, self-consciously on Augustinian language, talking about rest. Augustine begins by saying the heart is restless above all things until it finds rest in you, O Lord. And what you have in Augustine's Confessions is really Augustine reflecting on his own quest for the truth. But the quest for the truth about God is inseparable from the truth about himself. And what I love about that book is how the whole thing is cast as a prayer. So it can never be, even the genre prevents you taking Augustine's great discovery of the truth as something purely objective. He himself is transformed in his discovery of the truth, and he's driven to prayer. And he's driven to contemplation. So what I think you've described so beautifully captures Augustine. And for my money, Augustine is capitalizing on what the Apostle Paul says. He's innovative in a literary sense, but his theology is deeply consistent with that of the Apostle in the New Testament.
Absolutely. And I think that when we talk about um, the purpose of knowing and what is truth and like what it means to be a human person, it also speaks to, um, with respect to, I think something you might have mentioned, how we are relational beings, like we're beings made for relationship. And I think that one way that, and this is something that the document from the Church Antigua et Nova touches on, is how this new form of technology actually has an impact on the way that we relate to other people.
Yeah,
Specifically, it talks about how when we trade the normal process of knowing with just click a button and you get whatever you want, it almost creates a transactional mentality with respect to other people and how we relate to them, where it's just about what can you give me or give me the answer. Versus, I remember years ago, I had this project that I was doing for my parents. I was taking a bunch of home videos and I wanted to just make a Christmas video for them of all family videos. And I remember when I was watching those videos, at that time, they didn't have phones. Or maybe they had phones, but they were like, they were just meant for texting or whatever. But something I admired was in the videos where everyone would be sitting around the table at Christmas time or whatever, everyone was able to actually sit and talk with each other. They
yeah,
were able to actually be in the moment. Like being was enough. Like what they were receiving was relationality. What they were receiving was receptivity and just being. And I think that technology like this, when used wrongly, can lead people to not know how to be relational and also to think that just sitting at a dinner table is not enough, that there has to be something that I'm getting or something I'm getting on the level of stimulus or data or whatever.
yeah. I think absolutely correct. I mean, in some ways, I think think of the telephone as an invention. It's a good example. Now, I'm an immigrant. I have an elderly mother. My wife has an elderly mother. They're 3,500 miles away. the ability to call them on the telephone is great. It brings us together even though we are separated. And yet when you think how the smartphone has permeated the whole of life, the phone has ceased on the whole to be a piece of technology that draws us together and has become something that kind of drives us apart. And one of my wife's pet hates is we'll go out every now and then, we'll go out to a nice restaurant for a meal. And the rule is when we're out for a meal, the cell phones are away. Put it in my jacket pocket. I don't look at it throughout the course of the meal. And my wife will look around the restaurant and see people sitting at the table looking at their cell phones. I remember once we were in London a year or two ago at a very nice restaurant, and she was shocked that a young couple came in, a beautiful young girl and obviously her husband. He sat the entire time staring at his cell phone. And it was all my wife could do not to get up, walk across to the girl and say, you need to kick him to the curb. You deserve a whole lot better. So I think smartphones have really served to drive us apart. And televisions can be very similar as well. When I teach a course at Grove City College, and I get the students to read Robert Burns's poem, The Cotter's Saturday Night, which is the description of family worship in a home on a Saturday night, preparing for Sabbath day services. And they all gather around the inglenook. And I say to the students, what is the inglenook? It's the fireplace. I said, what's interesting about fireplaces is they brought the focal point of the living room, drew people together. Here they are sitting around the fireplace, and father's reading the Bible, they're singing together, etc., etc. And I'll say, what's the focal point of living room today? And the students will say, well, it's the television. I said, well, and does the television draw people together or drive them apart? Physically, they're brought together in order to stare at a screen and not talk to each other. So it metaphysically drives them apart. And I think, again, this is not, artificial intelligence is not the only aspect of technology that poses significant challenges to our basic humanity. And I'm not I own a smartphone, I own a television. I'm not polemicizing against them. I'm saying we need to be self-critical in the role that we allow these things to play in the way we live our lives.
No, absolutely. And in your book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, you talk about how there's a relationship between how we come to a sense of who we are and our relationship to the culture in which we're living. And you talk about how in times past, human self coming to a sense of your identity as a self was more stable because there were fewer options and things were kind of more stable. There was kind of going back to the fireplace example, there was something central that segued into a sense of this is who we are. For example, the example you just gave, who are we? Oh, we're a family. And we're doing something that is central to what it means to be a family is we're being together by this fire. But then you also talk about how emerging new forms of technology and stuff, and also the newspaper, stuff like that, have led to an explosion of options or different ways of kind of having a new social imaginary of what it means to be a self. How would you say artificial intelligence, specifically in the realm of because when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's obviously it's not just like one thing. There's different kinds. So I think what we're talking about specifically is in the realm of generative AI, ChatGPT, the type of AI that's programmed to just give you lots of data and quickly, and also whatever you want to ask, just quickly. How has that data being sped up at the touch of a button led to maybe a further splintering of options or a sense of who we are?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's no simple answer to that. I think there are a number of aspects that listeners should think about. And first of all, I think what we're living through is a period of what the German philosopher Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration. And his point is there that technology destabilizes the status quo. The reason I'm a Protestant and you're a Catholic goes back to the Reformation. Well, what is the Reformation? The Reformation was a world destabilized by the arrival of the printing press. That changed everything in Europe, and it took years for European culture to stabilize around what the printing press was doing. Well, when you think about today and IT, we're having almost the equivalent of the printing press invented every couple of months. I have a colleague at Grove City College who's trying to get a book published on artificial intelligence. The problem is, any book you submit a manuscript of today, it'll take 18 months to be published. It'll be totally out of date in 18 months' time. And that creates what Rosa calls social acceleration. The world seems to be constantly changing and destabilizing. There was less change in rural England between 1200 and 1500 than there has been in the United States of America since I arrived in 2001 and the present day. Change is very rapid, and that affects how we think of ourselves, because those external markers that gave us a sense of stability, value, relationship, they're constantly in flux. So there's that aspect to it. So artificial intelligence fits into that general accelerating feel of what technology is doing. Secondly, I think what artificial intelligence does is it pushes to at the nth degree a tendency within Western culture, or within world culture as a whole, that we've been seeing now for maybe 100 years or so, and that is a downplaying of the significance of the body. When I was at school, who are my friends? Well, my friends were the people that I got to hang around with at school and in the evenings. They were bodies. When you think about what artificial intelligence does, it replaces. For the longest time now, we've been used to chatting to people on email, Facebook, etc., etc. They don't need to be bodies. And what artificial intelligence is doing in some ways is raising the question, do they even need to exist at all? You read these weird stories of men falling in love with chatbots. Listeners may be interested to look up, I know Albania doesn't feature highly in a lot of people's imaginations, but the Albanian Prime Minister recently appointed a chatbot as a member of his cabinet. And so the very need for the other people with whom we are dialoguing to exist is being called into deep question by artificial intelligence. So, in answer to the question of what is the result of this acceleration, I think twofold. One, it exacerbates that feeling of vertigo that has really come to grip the West, at least the Western imagination, for the last 50 to 100 years, which is a result of general technological innovations. And it's also challenging humanity on one of the most central points of what it means to be human, and that is we're bodies. Thomas Aquinas is wonderful on this. We are a unity of body and soul. His commentary on 1 Corinthians 15, when he's wrestling with why do we need a resurrection, his answer is because you are not your soul. You are soul and body, and therefore your body needs to be raised. Well, the whole importance of the body is being called into deep question by technology, and particularly by artificial technology at this point.
Yeah, and I remember some time ago I was having a discussion with someone about what is philosophy and the importance of philosophy. I wish they would bring it back, not just to, I know in college, different colleges, maybe they offer classes. If it's a Catholic school, they might have a certain order. But if you go back to the scholastic period, there was a specific order in the realm of the curriculum because it was understood that there's a right way of learning. And I think when it comes to the right way of learning, it means learning responsibly, which means you don't just fire hose people with a bunch of random information at once, especially in their younger years. You have to start in the right place so that their minds can handle all the rest. And I think for young people, especially, even before the usage of artificial intelligence, it's just made it easier to get any information you want faster. But the point is if you, especially for a young person who's just developing their brain and just learning about the world, if you in general open up to them a whole plethora of means of knowing a bunch of random stuff without first forming their mind in
Yeah.
what does it mean to know truth and what it doesn't mean to know truth, then it could lead to a lot of, um, Martin Buber wrote a book called I and Thou, and he talked about the danger of people being surrounded by concepts that actually blind them. And I think that that can happen when irresponsibly, and it's not no fault of the kids who are doing this, but in for us who have the responsibility over others to say, is it wise to just say, here's a device where you could search up any question you want
Yeah.
without any kind of supervision to that learning process?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I mean, we've always taken the view that, or we did while I was growing up, that there's for example, age-appropriate literature. What's very interesting, of course, is the rhetoric that surrounds attempts to reimpose that in the United States now, focus on banning of books. Well, no, it's not banning a book to say that a book that describes this activity or advocates that viewpoint is not appropriate for a 7-year-old. A 7-year-old
Right.
needs to have a better understanding, he needs to have a context. When you think of the internet and think of the scourge of pornography, it's not surprising that there's a very skewed view of what sex is if your first exposure to sex education are hardcore pornographic videos online that have a very specific philosophy of what it means to be a human being underlying them, that's very, very problematic and yet can come to grip the imagination very, very quickly. So I think you're absolutely correct. Education is, we need to recapture that idea that what we're doing in education is helping people, young people, to go back to the point I made earlier, helping young people to understand what it means to be made in the image of God. And that doesn't mean that you're free and autonomous and can create your own set of meanings and rituals by which make life meaningful. It means you need to understand what the telos, what the ends of you are as a human being.
Yeah. And in your book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, in general, you talk about this increasing, and correct me if I'm wrong, this increasing inward turning on the self to a more subjective way of viewing what it means to be a person, what it means to be a body. And when you get to Nietzsche and you start talking about plastic people and you start talking about Nietzsche's idea of self creation, and I guess my question is, when we talk about this idea of self creation from Nietzsche and in general, the idea of plastic people, if you don't mind explaining that just a little bit, what, how would you say that, um, and this is something I've also discovered, like things like ChatGPT, stuff like that, has kind of furthered our culture of that stresses the importance of affirmation, that like healthcare, or for example, the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual for the American Psychological Association, like gender identity disorder. Now it's called gender dysphoria. But if you read, maybe they changed it. But the last time I read it, some time back, one of the ways it says to help people is to affirm whatever for the sake
Yeah,
of reducing psychological stress.
yeah,
And I've noticed with things like ChatGPT, what's not helpful is it is not, maybe there's forms of generative AI that have ethics programmed into it, but most of these do not, meaning it's not there to tell you right and wrong. It's there just to give you information. But if you ask it a certain way, it's almost in the tone, if you will, of affirming. Like, and it's not in the realm of not affirming, which can be very
right.
dangerous, especially because
Yeah,
nowadays everything is about make sure you affirm who I really am and never not affirm, never say anything unpleasant about
yeah.
myself or anything like that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think what you're pointing to there are a couple of things going on here. I think one is that we've seen a shift really over the last 200 years towards an understanding of human happiness as really an inner sense of psychological contentment. When the founding fathers of the US put the term, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into the Declaration of Independence, they had a very specific view of happiness there. And it's not what we think of as happiness. They were, I would say, broadly Aristotelian or sort of very vaguely Christian in their take, that they saw happiness as consisting in certain ways of living that were universal for all human beings, certain things, freedom, the right to own property. These things constituted happiness. As we've had this great inward move over the last 300 or 400 years, slowly but surely, the external shape of happiness has become attenuated, if not eliminated, and replaced by this idea that happiness is an inner sense of well-being. And one of the interesting things is one of the great analysts of this, a man called Philip Reef, wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic in the 1960s. And one of the comments he makes in The Triumph of the Therapeutic is, as we move inward, a number of institutions will become less authoritative. And I think he flags up church and nation. I might add family to that as well. He said, why? Because religion, nations, families, they demand sacrifices of the self. We've all had our mothers say to us, nobody in this family behaves that way, as a way of indicating that you are not free to behave that way. He says these things will become weaker because they are seen as interfering with happiness. And two institutions will become stronger. And he sort of talks about the hospital and the theatre. Yeah. And what he means there is the medical industry and the entertainment industry, because hospitals help our bodies feel good, and and theatre helps us not be bored, entertained. Well, that plays into when you come now to the AI. Well, of course, the tech bros have a vested interest in keeping you hooked. And so what do they have to do? They have to find out what you want and how you want it and let you have it just that way, to quote the old jazz song.
Burger King.
Or slow.
You are king.
Yes, slowly but surely perhaps lead you in a certain direction. So it's not surprising that if you're engaging with artificial intelligence, it's unlikely that a chat bot will ever say to you what friends say to me. Occasionally I'll be saying, and they'll say, it's inappropriate for a Christian to say that, or that's not a Christian. You need to change on that point. You shouldn't treat somebody like that. That's powerful coming from a friend, but it's never going to come from a chatbot. Not without prepping you to steer you in a certain direction. So I think you're right that the ethics of chatbottery, such as they are really the ethics of the marketplace.
Wow.
And not the ethics of normal interhuman dialogue.
Yeah, well, with respect to, talking about kind of attending to, especially on an American model, attending to whatever I want when I want it, and this idea of affirmation, I've used ChatGPT before. I think a lot of people have, and I've tested it many times. I've tried to find out, is this going to take up a position? And I've pressed it on various moral issues. And a lot of the times it will it'll say I'm just here to talk with you. I'm just here to kind of give you information. I don't really take up a position because I'm not a person, but I'm here if you want to talk about anything. It always ends with this sense of I'm here for you. I'm here to talk with you. This kind of mode of affirmation, which I think is very dangerous, because there are some topics some things that we're thinking about, that we're trying to figure out, that it's requires human conscious. I don't mean just to be conscious, but I mean conscience, and the experience and the empathy that each human person really has, that a chatbot does not. And so that's another realm of danger, is people seeking the ultimate questions from a database, a program that's meant to give me data, not meant to actually, because it cares about me, direct me towards my final end in God.
Yeah, I think it's right. And I believe there are certain examples, tragic examples over recent days, of young people who've been encouraged to and have committed suicide as a result of their interaction with chatbots. And again, I think, a lot of it tracks back to the body. There's a sense in which when I'm talking, when you're looking into somebody's eyes, when you're talking to them face to face, and I don't mean on a screen, but when you're actually in their presence, human communication is much more than words. There's a whole lot of things that come through almost unconscious, poker tells, we might say. And I've used the example many times of George Orwell on this. George Orwell, way back in the 30s or the early 40s, he found out that his publisher was publishing a book by Stephen Spender, the English poet. And Spender at the time was a notorious homosexual. He went on to be happily married and have kids, but at the time he was well known as part of the W.H. Auden sort of gay set. And Orwell wrote a pretty ferocious letter to his publisher for doing this. And sometime later, he was with Spender, and Spender made the comment to the effect of, you're not. I know about that letter. I can't get over how pleasantly you treat me. Why is that? And Orwell said, it's because I've looked into your eyes and I've seen that you're a man as I am a man. And that's always, I wouldn't say haunted me as an anecdote, but it's always stuck with me as an anecdote of, and that's why bodily presence is important. So, for example, when I write these days, I always try to think, what would happen if I bumped into the person I'm writing about at a party? Would I feel the need to apologize for anything, even if I still disagree with them? Would I feel the need to apologize for having demeaned them as a human being in the way I wrote? And again, the online mediated discourse, which takes the body out of the picture and makes insults very cheap and easy, I think has had a dehumanizing effect. And I worry about a rising generation of young people for whom online discourse is the norm and actual physical interaction is the exception.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. I think that
You must face this. If I can ask you a question, I mean, this
yeah,
must be
sure.
a real challenge as a pastor. Pastoring. I pastored a Presbyterian church myself for 6 years. Thankfully, before the internet had really come to grip, social media really gripped the imagination. But it must be hard as a pastor, wrestling with IT questions in terms of pastoral role and the shepherding of your sheep.
Yeah, I mean, as a priest, not a pastor yet.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. But God willing, someday.
Using the
But,
Protestant idiom, but of course, as a priest,
no,
yes.
as a priest, a parochial vicar, someday a pastor, but as a shepherd, as one called to watch over others. Yeah, I mean, there's a deep. I work with people every day, and that can never be reduced or replaced to a text message,
Right.
a video chat, a phone call, which maybe there's a time for that and it's good in itself. But
Yeah.
part of, like, for example, in the Catholic Church, the idea of sacraments is part of what makes them valid is you have to be in person because
Right.
Jesus became incarnate. He took flesh. So the body matters. The body is important. And that's why, especially during the time of COVID, there was a very difficult time, but it was a very upsetting time for a lot of people in the church because they wanted the sacraments. And
Yeah.
God bless those in leadership who had to navigate through that difficult time. But on a natural level, there was a lot of heartbreak because people wanted the Eucharist, they wanted confession, but all of those things you can't do over the phone. You can't do virtually. It requires being in person.
You can't confess to a chatbot.
Well, there was a thing in I forget what country it was, and I talked about this on my last episode where there was somewhere where and I think it's wrong. They had a chat bot that looked like Jesus in the confessional, and I thought that was so horrendous because this is a program. This is not a person, and it kind of gets to the question of AI and God. And how as a relational being, as a spiritual being, ultimately I'm called to relate to God and to dwell in the mystery of human life and to deal and to tolerate moments of unknowing, and how we could see with idolatry different forms of technology being used, but specifically getting to the issue of power and control. This, like, for example, Adam and Eve, one of the temptations was, he knows that you will be like God. You know, this
Yeah.
temptation to wisdom, to that knowledge, to take it for yourself, to be self sufficient. And I think that in addition to the social issues and leading to isolation and lack of, right human communication and the value of that, it also can lead to a sense of false independence where
Yeah.
I have all the answers and I don't need to turn to God. I don't need to turn. Why do I turn to the
Yeah.
Bible when I can turn to the chat GPT? Why would I talk to my priest? Why would I talk to God? And I think that is happening where people are asking questions to ChatGPT. These are things that they could be having a conversation, not just with other um, human beings, but also with God, who is a divine person, three divine persons. And so I think that's another kind of impact, especially as a priest, that and working with people is making sure that ChatGPT is replacing genuine time for like, I could talk to God about this. I don't have to get an instant answer, which we want all the
Yeah.
time. But some things, it's not about getting an answer. It's about relationship.
Yeah, and I think there you're pointing towards a broader question relative to the way technology makes us imagine the world. Uh, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, in the 1950s gave a lecture which has been reprinted in English as the essay "The Question Concerning Technology." And in that essay, he makes the point that we tend to think that technology is a tool, but there are tools and there are tools. A hammer, for example, does one thing: it drives in nails. But he draws an analogy. He says, think about a river. You can build a bridge over a river, or you can dam the river up to generate hydroelectric power. And his point is, in the first, you're sort of respecting the integrity of the river. In the second, you're imagining the river to be raw material that you can turn into something completely different. And I think we live in a world now where the technological tools we have tilt us towards thinking of nature and the world as raw material that we can do with what we wish. And what that also does then is it makes us impatient with limits. Limits become things that prevent us from being ourselves, prevent us from being authentic, or you and I would say, theologically, remind us that we are not God, and allow that rebellion some sort of plausibility in our imaginations. Bottom line, of course, is that however we can think that way all we like, but sooner or later, to return to the body, I think our bodies have the last laugh. I've said to the students, you can self-identify as anything you want, but if you self-identify as immortal, your bodies will have the final word. You will find that self-identification doesn't work. The body still has that authority. And of course, when we think about technology, well, where is technology now focused in part on immortality, overcoming that last limitation? Our minds are gripped by the gender, sexual limitations of the body. I'm a man, but can I be a woman? In actual fact, tech is already focusing upon the next boundary. Can I make myself immortal? Is my very own mortal limitation a problem?
Well, with respect to that, as I said, there's different kinds of artificial intelligence. I mentioned it last time on my last episode about the categories. There's by capability, functionality, and technology. And one thing that when we get into by capability, there's three categories within that. The first is artificial narrow intelligence. The second is artificial general intelligence. And this is the one kind of touching on what you're getting into, this idea of making ourselves gods, is artificial superintelligence. That people have discussed artificial intelligence's ability to almost become on its own apart from the
Right.
programmers. Obviously, that's an impossibility, and it's not. That's the essence of artificial intelligence. Is it has its origin in us? Like that is literally. It's not organic. Like we made it, we programmed it, we kind of, you know, got it going and whatnot. But we still give the parameters. We kind of analogously put a nature into it by its programming. I don't like to describe it that way, but nevertheless, this idea of super intelligence and artificial intelligence is that someday um, we will have something And it really is. It can lead to a real form of idolatry. Is like, this is our God. Maybe we won't say it
Yeah,
explicitly, but like,
yeah,
this is the, because with all the different forms of technology that we've been talking about, think of like when Humane Vitae came out. And a little bit before that, before contraception was discussed, before it was discussed in the moral evil of it and how it should be used, whatnot, a lot of people didn't know what it was and that it was bad. There was just an idea of, well, this is a new form of technology, and we it helps us to achieve what we want, to achieve what we want to get. But that question of like just be it always goes back to the temptation of Adam and Eve to reach out and to
yeah,
be your own God, because
yeah,
we can make something happen, because we can do it, we can make it happen. So it's a good thing. But obviously we know that's not true with every form of technology that comes out. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. And when it comes to this idea of super intelligence or super artificial intelligence, the idea there is really getting to the heart of something very central to man, and going back to Adam and Eve, is knowledge. This
yeah,
idea of I know. And that's literally the name of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And there's a connection between knowledge and God. And the devil's temptation was like, don't you want to be? He knows that if you do this, you will be like God, knowing good from evil. So this idea of like knowing and divinity or divinizing ourselves goes together. And I definitely can see this idea of super intelligence being a segue into this. We don't need God because we have.
yeah,
I mean, that's what happened after the Enlightenment period. Just then, it was this
yeah.
idea, and the it was this idea of we have the answers. We don't need theology, and we don't need certain realms of philosophy because we have science. We have the answers.
Yeah, I think you're again hitting the nail on the head there. I think I can't remember who it was, but one of the tech bros recently was asked, does God exist? And his answer, which was a very witty one, was not yet. And
Oh
the
my
idea
gosh.
was that we can by producing these supercomputers or super intelligences, we will create God. He will emerge. Um, and also, I think, yeah, it's crazy, but I think that you're also putting your finger on something there that explains why what seems to be in some ways a suicidal road is proving so compulsive. That the creation of artificial intelligence seems to be, at least in its most extreme form, something that will ultimately render human beings obsolete.
Mm.
And that goes, I think, down to a fundamental aspect of human psychology. What gives human beings a buzz? Well, Nietzsche puts his finger on it. Nietzsche sees it. It's killing God. When the madman runs into town square, he's sort of exhilarated. We've killed God. What a great
Mm.
feeling it is. Nothing makes one feel divine, more divine than killing God. Well, we might say, where are the last vestiges of God in our post-Christian world? Well, it's man as made in God's image. It's man as being exceptional in some way. So what's the next stage? Once we've killed God, we've got to kill human beings made in his image as well. And that creates this paradoxical situation where our own self-annihilation, I think, is an exhilarating thing. We are exceptional creatures because we're made in God's image. But if we can somehow make ourselves unexceptional, that's the next stage in the war against God. So it
Mm.
seems odd. I've seen some interviews recently where people have said to these guys doing AI, you say this is going to eliminate humanity. So why do you do it? And they sort of say, well, we don't know. But to me, it makes perfect sense that they do it. Because if you want to smash the authority of a God, you've got to smash its images. Iconoclasm is the way to go about it. And the images of God that are left, human beings, I think smashing the image of ourselves as being made in God's image, that's a powerful and exhilarating thing.
Wow. Well, I mean, I couldn't help but as you were talking, thinking of St. Augustine when he stole the apples. This
Yeah,
exhilaration that comes from just doing
yeah,
something bad, but not just, it's not even just doing something bad, but doing what one wanted, achieving this
yeah,
idea of like, I simply wanted to do this, and
Yeah.
we did it, and that is exhilarating. And we're not
Yeah.
calling it morally good, but we're saying that. And of course, you talked about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of, how he said, "Well, I'm good," and I didn't actually. But nevertheless, that idea of, exhilaration from, and that's what leads to the temptation of Adam and Eve, was probably that, like, whenever there's temptation, there's some kind of desire for something. And in the case of a temptation to sin, it's a disordered desire. But something good is presented, and the devil was presenting genuine goods, but it
Yeah.
was disordered. But that, nevertheless, that desire to be like God and to reach out and take was
Yeah.
exhilarating, because it was like, wow,
Yeah.
that's a big offer that you're giving to us. That's a big proposal. And obviously they took it, and here we are in 2025. In the gospel today, St. Paul says, um, he says, "Woe to me, wretched man that I am." But then he says, "Thanks be to God for Jesus Christ." So that's and so I conclude that.
Yeah.
Thanks be to God for Jesus Christ. But
And when you think about the temptations of Christ himself, I mean, the irony there, of course, is that Christ is simply being tempted to be who he is. You are God, therefore you can do these things. And he resists that temptation. That's the beautiful thing, or one of the beautiful things about the temptations in the wilderness, is that Christ himself has every right, in some ways, to do what the devil is presenting to him, but he won't do it. And I think that's something that we need to reflect upon. Again, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Adam could reach out, and Eve could reach out and take the fruit, but she shouldn't have done it. Christ could reach out and become, throw himself off the temple and be borne up by a legion of angels, but he didn't. And I think the Lord teaches us something pretty profound at that point about temptation.
yeah, no, I mean, I remember I was talking with someone about this, about, there was like this video on YouTube, and there was a debate going on about the temptations of Jesus, and about like the nature, and the way that I've come to understand it, theologically speaking, like to actually make sense of it, is that he could never be tempted within himself, because part of the idea of temptation is it has to do with something within you that has the possibility of doing that. But obviously, that's not the case for Jesus because of who he
Yeah.
is. So what we would say is that the temptations, like you said, were presented to him, and obviously they repulsed him. But continuing on with what you said, because of who he is, yes, he could have turned that stone into bread. He could have jumped off the temple and been born up. He could have accepted, even though it doesn't even make sense, all the kingdoms of the world, even though the world is his. Um, he doesn't do it because who he is the Son in relationship to the Father and the Holy Spirit, and they are
Yeah.
one. And he never digresses from the will of the Father whom he loves. But that's always the temptation, is to love ourselves over God. And Jesus, obviously, as the new Adam, shows what it means to love other over self, which leads to choosing rightly versus this kind of perverted model of, everything is about, what can I get? What
Yeah.
can I choose? What can I reach out and take? And that was the devil with the battle with Michael. I will not serve, non serviam. This idea of like I in isolation, but this leads to like kind of an inward focus on what's valuable, what's important, why do I do things, um, and so yeah, no, it definitely it always goes back to Genesis. We could always go back to
Yes.
the garden.
Yeah. Very much.
Um, well, very good. Well, I think that um, this was a very fruitful conversation, and Dr. Truman, I want to thank you so much for coming on today.
It's a pleasure.
We waded through these new waters, which, as I admit, a lot of this stuff is still, and the church is still grappling with. How do
Yeah.
we address these various areas where artificial intelligence is impacting? So I
Yeah.
want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your knowledge and your insights. Do you have any? Is there any final comments or thoughts that you wanted to express about the topic? or in
Actually,
general?
I'm going to recommend an artificial intelligence site to your listenership, actually, that I found very
Okay,
helpful.
sure. Thank you.
And that is magisterium.com.
Yes.
It's a database
Yes.
with very limited data, but I found it incredibly helpful. You can ask this database what the Catholic Church believes about anything. And not only will it tell you what the Catholic Church believes, it will link you to official Catholic Church documents
Music
to
to my
back up
ears.
what it says. So I don't want to go away leaving listeners with the impression that artificial intelligence is uniformly bad. I found
Yes.
this incredibly helpful in my teaching. I'll get students asking me, what does the Catholic Church believe about this? And I say, well, I think I know, but let's just check. And we go to magisterium.com, and it's a wonderful thing. So if you're going to use artificial intelligence, I would say to your listeners, use magisterium.com. It's a really good site.
Wonderful. Well, I've heard about that. I have yet to check it out, but I definitely will. But Dr. Truman, thank you so much for being here today. God bless you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Likewise.
Okay, thank you.